It became a contest. Two Japanese officers covered in sweat and blood, racing each other to see who could kill 100 people first. The results of the game were even written up in the newspaper, the Tokyo Daily News. A sort of gossip rag in Imperial Japan wrote a headline tracking the achievements of Lieutenants Mukai and Noda. Incredible record, Mukai 106, 105 Noda. Both second lieutenants go into extra innings and attached a photo taken for them by Shinzu Sato near Chungju City. And competition for beheading 100 enemies. Two lieutenants already got 80 people. Two young lieutenants of Katagiri unit started the competition of killing 100 people. We heard that since Wuxi, soon one has killed 56 and the other 25. In 1948, new Japanese government held a trial for Noda and Mukai. They were found guilty and executed. The execution of Mukai and Noda was a rare occurrence. Most of the perpetrators and the crimes we are going to tell you about in this video were either killed during the war or somehow escaped justice in post-war Japan. The Pacific War was full of contrasts. Unspeakable cruelty on one side, extraordinary valor on the other. Iwo Jima embodied that second reality. 80 years ago this February, Marines fought for 36 days on 8 square miles of volcanic rock, knowing many wouldn't leave. That kind of sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Praesidus Watch Company, the video sponsor, builds watches specifically to preserve these stories. Praesidus was founded to honor World War II veterans, starting with the replica of the A11 watch that veteran Tom Rice lost in the ocean at Normandy. Their name comes from the Latin word for protector. Their Iwo Jima 80th commemoration watch, one of their most sought-after pieces, carries actual sand from Iwo Jima's black volcanic beaches in its double-layer dial. It's built around a USA-made AmeriQuartz movement, housed in a 38mm stainless steel case with DLC coating and super luminova hands. Each piece is a wearable reminder of the grit and sacrifice that defined that battle. It's crafted for those who appreciate tangible connections to the past. The link and discount code are in the description. Let's get back to it. Today on A Day in History, the sick and twisted games of the Japanese in World War II. Lieutenants Noda and Mukai were sadly not alone. Let's be clear, all armies throughout history up to today have committed atrocities. But there is a significant difference. Even in Hitler's Germany, the crimes of the regime were hidden, or they were at least tried to be hidden from the public. In Stalin's Soviet Union, mass killings and arrests happened all the time. People knew about it through the word of mouth or having witnessed these things. But unless the victims were powerful politicians that Stalin wanted killed, things were kept relatively quiet, a sense of silent terror. In the Japanese Army of World War II, pictures of murders were taken. Soldiers took turns killing helpless civilians and POWs. They drank immense quantities of sake and had food brought to them while they were doing their killing. Photographers watched and took pictures. Officers encouraged their men. It became a game. And while tallies such as Mukai and Noda's weren't common, they weren't rare either. Most games didn't involve a score as such, but did include increasingly cruel ways of killing and bets on the results. Sometimes the games weren't games at all, but practice, which is what the soldiers themselves called it. Though it did not happen in every unit, and not every Japanese officer even approved of things like this, throughout the Japanese Empire, POWs and civilians were often used to season recruits and get them used to killing. If you know what happened to the men, women, and children that were chosen as practice targets, you might hope that practice targets meant the firing squad, a quick and relatively painless death if done right. But that wasn't what happened. Most times, practice meant bayonet practice for recruits. Picture a bunch of recruits, most of them just out of training and outside their hometowns for possibly the first time in their lives. An officer appears to tell them that before they can become real soldiers, and before they can say they've been hardened, they have to learn to kill. They're led to a bound prisoner and told to use him or her as a live target. Young soldiers often hesitated. In some cases, they were laughed at by others or berated by their officer, who orders them to thrust the bayonet into the prisoner's body. Accounts of Japanese soldiers often recorded the officer showing the soldiers how it was done, or standing with the recruit to offer tips. and often told to repeat their action on the dead or dying prisoner, told by their officers to use better form. In this case, killing wasn't about killing the enemy. The enemy didn't matter. The killing itself was treated as an exercise, demonstrated, repeated, and sometimes even judged. And it wasn't as if these things happened in some isolated practice field. They happened in front of their soldiers, many of who cheered their comrade on or teased him when he hesitated. Officers judged style, usually based on some notion of how the samurai looked in combat or how close to the field manual a student could get in his bayonet thrusts. Sake and extra food were sometimes given as a reward. When the Japanese overran the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia, in early 1942, they took thousands of Dutch and Australian prisoners. On the island of Ambon, hundreds of Allied POWs were killed near an airfield called Laha. It took several days in which the POWs tried to find ways to escape or sat with the terror until their turn came. Survivors and post-war testimony tell of Japanese naval officers lining up with their swords, keenly waiting their turn to behead prisoners. Blades were borrowed so that those without one could participate. One executioner couldn't figure out how to get a clean cut on a kneeling prisoner, so another came over with a small flashlight and illuminated the best angle for beheading. All the while, the prisoner was on his knees waiting for the end. During the war, the Japanese often picked on the biggest Allied soldiers they could find, a way of showing Japanese superiority, and singled them out for especially brutal treatment. At Ambon, one Japanese complained that the blade he was given bent when he tried to decapitate his victim. We don't need to tell you how he bent the blade. After the war, a small number of Japanese were put on trial for the Ambon Massacre. One defendant actually defended what he did by telling the court that he used proper form to kill quickly, as if that made it okay. This is Australian Commando Sergeant Leonard Sifleet with his fiancée shortly before the war began. Remember it, because a Japanese officer's sword ended this man's life, and the picture of it was publicized during the war after it was found on the body of a dead Japanese officer in New Guinea in 1944. Sifleet's execution, and the picture showing him helplessly awaiting his execution by beheading, became a rallying cry in Australia and in the US. His death and its method were ordered directly by Japanese Vice Admiral Michiaki Kamada and carried out by Navy officer Yasuno Chikao, who had the execution photographed as his admiral ordered. If you look very carefully, you can see that everything about Sifleet's execution was staged for the photo and to make it appear that Chikao was the large, powerful samurai. The angle was calculated. The men behind formed into a semicircle to watch, while the Japanese put their final touches on the execution ground. Sergeant Sifleet waited blindfolded. For his part in this atrocity and the ordering of Sifleet's death and the murder of 1,500 Indonesians and torture and starvation of 2,000 Dutch POWs, Kamada was executed by a Dutch firing squad in 1947. When the American Protectorate of the Philippines fell in 1942, tens of thousands of US and Filipino soldiers were taken prisoner by the Japanese. On the Bataan Peninsula near Manila, these soldiers were subjected to brutality on par with that of any other atrocity committed by the Japanese in the field. Japanese soldiers bayoneted men who looked at them too long, looked at them too angrily, tried to drink out of wells, streams, and muddy puddles in the jungle heat. Men who fell behind were bayoneted or beaten to death. Any Allied soldier attempting to stop the violence was usually beaten or killed too. Filipino women and children lined many parts of the route taken by the POWs on their way to a camp about 60 miles from where they were captured. Some women gave water and food to passing soldiers when they could. Those seen by Japanese soldiers were killed. All the while, Japanese soldiers took bets on which soldiers would fall out and collapse. Then, when he did, they would take turns stabbing or shooting him, often making it last. After accounts of the Bataan Death March and other atrocities reached home, Americans saw recruiting posters like this throughout the country and in newspapers and magazines. In turn, US troops fighting the Japanese sometimes crossed the line into atrocity as well, but not on a level even close to that of the Japanese, whose killings were both legal within Japanese military and often rewarded. After the Americans returned to the Philippines in 1944, the Japanese began to kill as many POWs as they could. They wanted no witnesses. On the island of Palawan in 1944, prison camp guards went berserk. Some of the guards were Koreans, forced by the Japanese to be brutal or face similar consequences. About 150 U.S. prisoners were forced into air raid trenches, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. If they were going to be killed, they could have been shot, but this was more amusing to the guards, who competed with each other on accuracy as men tried to escape, or the victims ran screaming from the trenches. After the fall of British possessions Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaysia, thousands of British and British Imperial troops were taken prisoner. Most were sent to Burma, where the Japanese, with the permission of the collaborationist Thai government, needed to build a railway into Burma to both complete the conquest of that British colony, while at the same time building a supply and transport route to the borders of India, the richest of all Britain's possessions at the time. The workforce, which seemed limitless to many Japanese but wasn't, couldn't be killed, at least in mass. They were needed too much. But beatings and other punishments to motivate them. That happened almost every minute of every day somewhere along the route for years. Beatings became competitions. A guard would begin striking a prisoner, again often a large man, and often for no other reason than the guard wanted to appear tough in front of the other men and the POWs. Frequently, soldiers would take turns striking a man to see who could knock him down with one blow. Sometimes dozens of men would line up for a chance. When the man fell, the sport became kicks until he was unconscious. After the war, POWs described guards taunting and laughing at their prisoners, turning the event into a party game. No thought was given to the prisoner. It was the spectacle that mattered. The most infamous unit of the Japanese War was Unit 731. We've already covered the history of the unit in another video of ours, which we encourage you to watch so that we don't go into too much detail here. Unit 731 was a biological and chemical warfare research unit responsible for likely hundreds of thousands of deaths. When you consider that they intentionally spread plague and used gas against Chinese civilians throughout much of the war. At Unit 731, games were given scientific names. Here, the torture and examinations were sometimes called practicals, as in practical exams. New doctors and nurses to the unit would be ordered to carry out experiments and surgeries on live, conscious patients without anesthesia. Victims of frostbite, people who were either forced into freezers naked or out into the Manchurian winter, were then submerged in freezing water until ice formed on their skin, and then they were struck with wooden batons. Witnesses said it sounded like wood on wood. Bets were placed on how long a prisoner would live while being vivisected. If you don't know what vivisection is, it's an operation performed on live animals for experimentation or other scientific research. This time, the subjects were people who were not given any anesthetic. Most of the time, these operations were performed in front of an audience. People were intentionally infected with plague, syphilis, or anthrax, and doctors, the people who are usually trusted with our well-being, placed bets once again. The Japanese military was notoriously harsh on recruits and enlisted personnel. Training sergeants and soldiers with seniority would randomly beat recruits to toughen them up. This was not an exception. In the Japanese military, beatings were a regular and expected occurrence. If you could endure the beatings, you were tough. If you did the beating, you were even stronger. Now, imagine the pent-up fury of the Japanese soldier when he met a helpless enemy, especially one whose planes were bombing Japanese cities into dust. An essential part of the Japanese soldiers' training was ideological in nature. Soldiers were forced to memorize slogans and quotes for the parade grounds and the barracks. In 1882, a direct order from the Imperial House told them their duty was absolute. The 1941 Japanese version of the training manual said a soldier that duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. As you likely know, every Japanese was taught from birth that the emperor was divine, and so was duty to him. A person's life was nothing if it wasn't filled with dedication to and love for the emperor. Think about it. If a man believed his own life meant nothing, then what must have he thought about the life of the enemy? It is sometimes overlooked, But racism played a central role in the motivation of the Japanese, not only for conquest, but for cruelty. In textbooks, newspapers, magazines, speeches, music, and the radio news, Japanese soldiers and civilians were told that the gods created Japan itself, that the emperor was a god, and that they were superior to all others. In their anti-Semitic movies and posters, the Nazis portrayed Jews as rats and disease germs. It's often forgotten that the Japanese also made similar types of films. China was portrayed as an overpopulated and dirty country, and its people were likened to rats. The Filipinos were racially mixed and Christian. You already know what they thought of Allied prisoners, who they thought of as even lower. One reason being because they surrendered, something a Japanese soldier was taught was the worst thing they could do. If admirals are giving orders to behead people, and the government, through words, posters, radio, etc., encouraged people to hate, then it's no surprise that the officers and men of the Japanese military had no reason to worry about reprisal. And since no one believed, or at least said out loud, that Japan would lose, then what kind of punishment did the perpetrators have to worry about? None. The many sick contests that took place in Nanjing in 1937 were well known in Japan, and the men who conquered the cities turned into heroes, men like Lieutenants Mukai and Noda. Throughout the Japanese Empire, atrocity turned into ritual, into training, and into games. The number and scope of these incidents make it clear that brutal, atrocious behavior was not only drilled into the men of the Japanese military, but also rewarded. Sadly, too often forgotten are the victims, whose last hours or minutes were filled with the sounds of men laughing, drinking, keeping score, and encouraging each other as they killed.